Hello, church. Here we are in week 9 of our midweek Bible studies that center around the book by Justin Earley, The Common Rule, Habits for Purpose in an Age of Distraction. This week, we're going to finish our weekly habits and really wrap up the book as a whole as we look at the idea of practicing a weekly Sabbath. An interesting idea that I think is going to be powerful for each of us in our own personal lives. When I was in college, I spent 2 summers in Colorado leading church groups on backpacking trips in the mountains. Now, what the work we did is we would take the groups into the mountains. Our goal would be to summit a peak, but we would also lead them on the hiking. We would be responsible for the devotionals. We would help them cook the meals. Really, we were in charge of every aspect of life for this group of 20 people over the course of the week as we were in the backcountry in Colorado. And also safety was a big concern and a big responsibility that each of us bore on our shoulders. We led the groups. We did all this. It was very strenuous. It wore you out physically, it wore you out mentally, and honestly, it wore you out spiritually as well, pouring into the lives of these people for a week. At the end of every week, we'd get back to our lodge, and the groups would leave, and then what we would do is all of our guides, we had about 36 hours off before the next group would show up. We'd spend that time, we'd go to dinner, and we would tell stories. Funny enough, we'd actually, on our days off, we'd go hiking as a group. We'd go rafting, we'd walk around the local town, we would shop, we would have church. We would do a lot of these really good things. It was a time of rest and a time of relationship. And what's amazing is week after week, with this strenuous and draining job, people didn't really complain about being tired. We would work ourselves to the bone, but that short break in between groups was all it took for us to rest and rejuvenate and be ready for the week ahead. There's something powerful about finding times of rest. It's almost like we were made that way, like we were made for rest. I also serve on the board of a Church of Christ youth conference in the Houston area. It takes place every year. It's a great event that our youth participate in. About 1,000 teenagers come every single year. It's really, really good. I love helping put it on, but it is a lot of work. It's a year-round effort for us to do it. There's 6 of us on the board, and it takes a lot of work for the 6 of us to organize and to plan out all of the many things that this event needs. I take pride in the job we do, and usually it goes off without any major hitch. 3 years ago, the day before the event, it's normally a day that's packed with last-minute planning, with final details, with organizing everything. I got sick, and I don't get sick very often, so it really threw me off that I got sick on this day. I was sure that the event was going to fail because I wasn't able to be there to take care of all the things I was responsible for. And I was responsible for some pretty major items. I limped in halfway through the second day of the event, nervous to see how things were going, sure that it had unraveled because I wasn't there. And what I found is that it was as if they didn't need me at all. It was as if my presence or my lack of presence hadn't been noticed at all. Now, the story's purpose isn't to say that I'm not a helpful part of the conference team, but more to say that we usually aren't as important as we think we are. When it comes to Sabbath, we make all sorts of excuses. We can't take breaks because if I take a break, if I take a day off, things are going to fall apart. Life is going to unravel. Who has time for a day of rest? What we're going to see Justin explain in the video is that we aren't as big of a deal as we might think we are, and really, we can't afford to not take the time to rest and have Sabbath. So, let's watch the video, and then we'll gather back to talk a little more.
Hi, and welcome back to this video series on the Common Rule, Habits of Purpose for an Age of Distraction. The Common Rule is a book about 8 daily and weekly habits designed to form us in the love of God and neighbor. This video series is a guide to reading the book, discussing the habits in community, and most importantly, practicing them together. Today, we're going to be talking about the last weekly habit, which is the habit of Sabbath. And what we're going to find is that in the rhythm of Sabbath, we encounter the rhythm of the gospel. We see in Sabbath that everything important in the world has already been finished by Jesus, so we can rest. There's some really good practical reasons to Sabbath. When I talk to groups of lawyers about taking a day off, I make legitimate arguments for productivity. Whatever you want to be, you're not going to get there by working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's actually how you'll get to a nervous breakdown, like I did. Studies show, interestingly, that work productivity sharply declines after about 55 hours of work a week, which suggests that we need rest to be productive for our clients or our customers or our colleagues and not waste time and money. Sabbath also, in an ironic way, helps with planning and deadlines, because when you have to take a day off, you've got to say, okay, I'm not working tomorrow, so what do I need to get done? Whether that's the laundry or a PowerPoint deck or some email to your team, whatever it is, you've got to tie it up so you can take the day off. And this forces deadlines. It's practically useful. Duke Ellington once said, I don't need more time. I just need a deadline. Because work, at least if you're like me, it's like a gas. It's always going to fill the space that you give it. And often containing it to 6 days a week doesn't mean you get less done. It just means you actually get something done. So I say all that. But all of that, that's nice. It barely scratches the surface of what Sabbath really does to us. What we're really doing when we Sabbath is we're confronted by a new identity. Here's how. In order to take a day off, in order to really stop your work for one day, you're going to have to reduce the idea of your importance. You're going to have to get comfortable with the idea that the world will make it for one day without you on email, or the world will make it for one day without you posting new content. You've got to get comfortable with the idea that your family is going to be fine if you postpone the errands. You've got to get comfortable with the idea that you actually really cannot finish it all. You can't. And this is so useful to realize. You know why? Because that's how reality is. You can't. We can't. We're small, limited, finite human beings who, when we pass away, people will forget our names. But the beauty of Sabbath is that when we rest, we are forced to turn our identity to a God who on the cross said, it is finished. And he's the one who tells us, actually, our names are written on his hands. And the most important person will remember our names. Which means that to lean into the practice of Sabbathing is actually to lean into the center of the Christian faith. That we are saved by something that someone else did. Something that we couldn't do. That's the message of grace. We can finally rest because God is the main actor and we aren't. Now, the practice of Sabbath is going to look really different across jobs and across life stages. So my biggest piece of advice is that Sabbath takes practice. You really have to work on it. You really have to work to find that rest. And I always find the phrase from the Rabbi Abraham Heschel useful. He said, a man who works with his mind should Sabbath with his hands, and a man who works with his hands should Sabbath with his mind. And I think it kind of reminds us that worship and rest are going to look different for different kinds of people. It's always going to include worship, and it's always going to include doing something different than we do through the week. But don't think nearly so much about what you shouldn't do. Think about what you should do. For me, that's the much more important question. For example, I spend some time Saturday making sure the week's work is finished up and making sure the house is clean enough to bear the not cleaning for 24 hours, which is, by the way, never always clean, just a little bit clean. And then we'll start our Sabbath, and we'll go out and do something fun as a family. We might hang out with friends Saturday night, and maybe on Sunday morning we'll go to the later service, since that's a nice way to preserve the unhurried character of the morning. And by the way, sometimes the only way to get our 4 boys on time to the service. Then Sunday afternoon, we do an extended family lunch where the cousins can play and the adults can have real conversation. The thing that I would take away from that is not for you to do what I do necessarily, but just think about it. There are so many ways to engage with worship and rest, and very importantly, Sabbath is communal. You're going to need other people to Sabbath with you. We need, as it turns out, people to help us create those rhythms and remind us that the most important work in the world was Jesus' work on the cross. And that is finished so we can rest. So that's the idea behind the weekly habit of Sabbath. As always, here's your fact to ponder, your question to discuss, and your habit to practice. Fact to ponder. It used to be that Americans demonstrated their status or their wealth by showing how much leisure time they had. Now it's flipped. We show off our status by showing how busy we are and how we don't have actually time for anything. So think about how Sabbath is a uniquely countercultural practice. For your question to discuss, I want you to talk about what would your ideal Sabbath look like? What would you do? How would you lean into worship? And how would you lean into rest? Now, your habit to practice this week is going to be to Sabbath. It doesn't have to be your ideal Sabbath, but just pick a day, get some friends, and try it together. See how you rest, see how you worship, and see what you learn. When you come back next week, you're going to have read the epilogue to the book on failure and beauty. And we're going to be talking about these two important concepts of spiritual formation, failure and beauty. As always, remember, your habits will not change God's love for you, but God's love for you can and should change your habits.
Well, I always appreciate what Justin has to say, and this week he does it again by convicting me of things that I need to focus on and that I need to put into practice in my own life. Sabbath and the power of taking time to rest is just another one of those things. So let's look at the why before we go any further. Why is Sabbath important? What does it mean to us, and why is it important to us? Well, first, we were created to Sabbath. When we look at the story of creation and what God does, he lays it out very quickly. He works for 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. It wasn't as if God was tired, and it wasn't as if God needed the rest, but he simply rested to model for us how we should live our lives. If God rested on the seventh day, then who are we to not? How do we think that we're better than God, that we're more capable than God, that we could do things that God couldn't do? This rhythm has also lasted since creation. From the time of creation until today, this rhythm of life has been there. Only in modern society have we tried to do away with it and say, we don't need that last day of rest. We don't need to take time off. Sundays used to be the day when our society all together collectively did that, but more and more things are creeping their way in there, and all of a sudden we've lost that as well. There's an expression from the 1600s. It's a French expression that you've heard, but where you burn the candle at both ends. And when this expression was made, it was to show how silly you would be to take a perfectly good candle, and it burns twice as fast when you burn it from both directions. It doesn't really produce that much more light. It's purely wasteful. Well, think about that when it comes to our lives. We don't produce that much more when we work around the clock, but we use ourselves up a lot faster. We use up our internal, our spiritual, our mental, our physical energy when we don't take time to rest and recuperate. It's almost as if when God created everything, he knew what he was doing. It's like he had a plan. He had thought this out, and maybe he knows what's best for us. Also, Sabbath reminds us of our dependence on God. You see, Justin talks about how we cannot do everything. You might think or you might hope or wish that you could do everything, but you can't. None of us can. Sabbath reminds us of this principle by forcing us to stop. At some point, you have to say, okay, that's it. That's all I can do for today. That's all I can do for this week. Most of the time, we think if I just work hard enough, if I do enough, then I, by my own force of power and will, can accomplish or get done what it is I think I want or that I need. It's up to me. But when we take 1/7 of our week and just set it off to the side, it puts productivity into perspective. It puts what we think we're capable of into perspective. So let's look at 3 ways that we can incorporate, you and I, that we can incorporate Sabbath into our life this week and this month. First, find a way to mark time. Pick a time and stick to it. One of the things that Justin talks about throughout this book and series is that we set the precedent, and exceptions can come and go, but we have it set. And so we know every week what we can count on and expect. Set a time, set a day, and stick to it. One of the things Justin said he and his family did, which I thought was really good, he said this in the book, they actually have a candle that at the beginning of their Sabbath, they light it. Their family does it all together. They light a candle, and that symbolizes that their Sabbath has begun, and it's really great for their children to model and to show, to put an image in front of the family that this now has begun our Sabbath time. But we can make this a teaching opportunity for your family, just like Justin did. And it doesn't just happen. Sabbath won't accidentally happen. It's not as if maybe it'll just, at some point we'll just kind of start Sabbathing if we just, it'll just this weekend, we'll probably have one. No, pick a time, mark the time, make it known, or write it down and let people know. Work your schedule around it in a way that will be successful. Don't do it in the middle of the work week, but find a time that works. The second thing, make it known. What I mean by this isn't about bragging. We should never brag about the habits, the spiritual practices that we're working on, but make it known for the purpose that people know that you won't be in contact during that time. Or at least, especially if you work, that you could say, you know what, if you email me on Saturday, I'll get back to you, but it probably won't be for a day or so. I think most people will understand if there is one 24-hour period in the week where you are not going to return phone calls or not return emails. I listened to a podcast that's made by a practicing Jew, and he always explains, a lot of it's about current events and what's going on, and he always explains how, he's like, man, I missed a lot on Twitter this week because all of Saturday my phone was turned off and put away. He talks about it. He makes it known. It's expected now. And once you set that out there, then people know what to expect from you. When you're always available, people will always reach out to you. But if they know that there's a certain time that you won't be available, people find ways to work around that. And then the third thing is that rest doesn't mean doing nothing. If you're like me, a day spent on the couch watching TV, I don't feel better after that. Maybe I enjoyed it in the moment, but afterwards, I really maybe even feel a little bit worse. This book talks a lot about doing restful things. Not doing nothing, doing restful things. Spend the day at the park. Have a meal with friends. Take a day trip with your family. Find something that fills you up. What are the things that refill you? What are the things that are restful to your soul? Maybe it is taking a nap, but it's not napping all day. It's that with other things. Find time to worship in your Sabbath. That's a critical part of what it is we do. But what are the things that fill your soul? What are the things that make you feel more alive? What are the things that prepare you for another week of work and life ahead? Sabbath means different things to different people. Justin quoted the rabbi who talked about if you work with your mind, Sabbath with your hands. If you work with your hands, Sabbath with your mind. And I think that's a great thing for us to think about. What kind of job, what context do you find yourself in? And what kind of Sabbath do you need from that? What are the things you could do, the active, restful things you could do to make your Sabbath all that it could be? Okay, a couple questions to leave with today. And I want you to, if you're by yourself, journal these out, write them down somewhere, put pen to paper. Don't just think about them, but actually do something to write it or something so that it's a little bit more real. Or if you're watching this with somebody else, then answer it together. But first, what would your ideal Sabbath look like? This is Justin's question. In a perfect world where money wasn't an option, there wasn't coronavirus, what would your ideal Sabbath look like? Number two, what are the things that have kept you from practicing Sabbath? This would probably be an easy one for us to write a long list of all the things: work, family, responsibilities, extracurriculars. What are the things that keep us from practicing Sabbath? What are some things you would need to not do on Sabbath? It's important to think about what we would do, but it's very important to intentionally think, what can I not do on Sabbath? Maybe your phone is a part of that. Maybe your email is a part of that. What are the things that I cannot do? And then lastly, what are the things that I could or should do for Sabbath? What are the things that I must include? It wouldn't be Sabbath without blank. So, as we close here today, church, I want you to talk about those things with whoever it is you're with. Write those things out. And our challenge, our habit, is to practice Sabbath one day this week. Church, I know you'll be blessed by this practice. So, for all of us, I'll see you next week. Thank you so much and have a great week.